Injuries on the civilian side too. Injuries on the civilian side too.
Most certainly. I mean, if the Americans are saying that 3 of their personnel were injured, that doesn't surprise me, because when you go down to the Abbey Gate to get in that way, there is a post overlooking the gate where there's a number of US soldiers stationed. I watched them myself the other day overlooking the crowds. And then just a few metres from them, there is a Taliban checkpost, and they watch each other all day. And then there's dozens. The other day when we were there were hundreds of civilians packed like sardines, banging at the gate, hoping for a chance to get in, holding their papers up to the Americans. So if there has been an explosion in that vicinity, there are certainly Americans posted above that wall overlooking everything, and may have been caught up in this. We heard this explosion at 5:40 p.m. local time, which is just over an hour ago. When we were there, we heard a second explosion, which was not as strong. And we also heard sirens coming from inside the airport. And then the Taliban had just pushed everyone back, and they had appeared to have brought in reinforcements. There were at least double the number of Taliban fighters down there guarding the entrance as there normally were. They were very tense. They were shooting in the air. I saw them break a camera from another journalist. And they were very tense and very concerned and shooting frequently.
Charlotte, we're also getting more news from the Americans that they suspect that this was a suicide attack. If that is the case, then it does lead into the direction of ISIL, doesn't it?
Yeah, ISIL's MO, if you will, in Kabul is to do suicide blasts that target civilians. Usually they target the Shia minority, and they have been a constant threat in the back of everyone's minds in Kabul for some years now, although it has been some time since they have pulled off any type of large attack. But they are very much enemies with the Taliban, and that is one thing that the West and the Taliban have had in common here, is their mutual hatred for ISIL. And ISIL pockets have been in the east of Afghanistan, but they have tried to target civilians in previous years. And this was definitely on everyone's radar that it would be easy for them to target the airport. The Taliban tried to push people back, but there were just so many people. There was no way to check people's bags, to pad people down as they entered the area, because the airport itself is so big. All they did was shoot in the air, and it appears it has not been enough.
Charlotte Bellis in Kabul, thanks very much for the update. Of course, we'll continue to monitor what goes on. These are live pictures coming from Kabul International Airport. Of course, the sun has set. It's early evening there now. It seems that the military operations to get people evacuated from the country continue, and that the bomb blasts that we've been hearing about haven't interrupted that sequence of events. However, everybody will be on alert. Let's just cross over to Kimberly Halkett, our White House correspondent in the US. Of course, the US just getting that news now. And Kimberly, we were getting various sourced information from the Pentagon about what they thought was behind these explosions. What are you hearing from them now officially?
Well, we should point out that the Pentagon is expected to brief, and so we are watching for the latest official updates out of the Pentagon and from the Department of Defense spokesperson John Kirby. But already the United States has confirmed that they suspect this was a suicide bomb. And as we have been reporting, there are potential casualties as well as injuries. We know there are injuries to at least 3 U.S. service members. The extent of those injuries is unclear. Now, here at the White House, things are changing very quickly. I can tell you that the U.S. President Joe Biden has been briefed on the explosion that has occurred at Kabul airport. I can also tell you that he already met with his top national security advisors. And in some ways, unfortunately, this was not unexpected. In fact, we know that the U.S. State Department, as well as other American officials, had been cautioning Americans. We know there are at least 1,500 that are still awaiting evacuation. They were told not to go to the airport because of concerns of what has now transpired, and that is some sort of explosion. What we are told is that this is potentially a suicide bomber that is behind this detonation. Now, given the fact that there was a warning in advance, it's not clear how many Americans, in addition to the service members, may potentially be affected by this. But again, this now begs the question about what is next. Now, the U.S. president, up until today, had been very firm about the withdrawal of U.S. troops to be completed by August 31st. But he said that with that being contingent on the continued evacuation of those that needed to get out prior to that withdrawal deadline. He also said that he was drawing up contingency plans and had directed the Pentagon to do so, but did not provide any details. So the question becomes whether or not the president would now be. These are the unanswered questions that are now percolating here at the White House. We will have an opportunity to hear from the U.S. president. He is scheduled to meet with the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. That is coming up at 15:30 GMT. We have not yet had word of whether or not that meeting will be delayed. We know that Afghanistan was one of the topics that would be discussed. It's very likely now that that will become a primary topic of discussion. And of course, some of these issues I've raised are certain to be asked by the reporters who will be present for the initial part of that Oval Office meeting.
Just to bring you up to speed from the wires that are dropping here from Reuters, Kimberly, no German troops injured in the explosion outside the airport. The Turks are saying they haven't been injured in this, though there were 2 explosions. Obviously, one would assume that the American president or those at the Pentagon will be speaking to their NATO partners that have military personnel at the airport, and they'll also be talking, if you're talking about these contingency plans, about how they are going to work together in terms of either the 31st of August or how to reevaluate the evacuation process.
The pressure was already on Joe Biden to extend this August 31st deadline, to keep American troops in country for at least a period of extended time to allow for the evacuations. There's no doubt that the pressure is going to be even more intense for him to become more flexible and potentially extend this deadline. Not only has there been domestic pressure on Capitol Hill, but also, of course, as he met earlier with the G7 leaders, they urged him to extend this August 31st deadline. So one can presume that that coordination is taking place. We, as mentioned, already know that there was a meeting in the Situation Room of the White House where the top security officials of the United States were briefing the president. We know since then he has been updated on this explosion. But again, we should remind our viewers that this is something that the White House was preparing for, given the fact that there had been indications and warnings that a suicide bombing or a bombing of some kind or disturbance of some kind could take place at the Kabul airport. That is why Americans were told not to go to the airport, and that's why the evacuation flights had slowed and there had been some interruption in that effort that the White House insists remains its highest priority. So these are questions that are being raised, we suspect, at the White House right now. The contingency plans, still not clear what those are, only that we can tell you the Pentagon had been directed to order those up, and we're now watching very carefully to see what the Defense Department will say moving forward. There is a Pentagon briefing that is scheduled, and there's no question that what is on the minds of so many reporters in that room is the very latest on what is happening at the Kabul airport.
For the moment, Kimberly Halkett, our White House correspondent, thanks very much. Let's just bring you up to speed on what we know so far. And we are getting a Taliban source now saying that as many as 11 people have been killed at Kabul airport, including foreigners, and also a suggestion that children may have also been injured. As Kimberly also confirmed from the US, we're also getting the same from the Pentagon, that 3 US personnel have also been injured in that blast, which happened just over an hour ago. The Germans and the Turks are saying nothing has happened to them, though they were close or in the vicinity of the blast. They seem to be OK. Let's cross over to Charlie Angelo in our London broadcast centre. Obviously, a very fast-moving story, Charlie, as the sun sets in Afghanistan. The Turks and the Germans saying they're OK. Americans have 3 injured. The Taliban now saying that as many as 11 have been killed. Of course, many phone calls, I'm sure, going from European capitals to the US and vice versa.
Yes, well, the word here from the UK Defence Ministry is that they're still trying to establish exactly what has happened, whether or not it has affected any of their personnel or the Afghans that they're trying to get out. And remember, there's still a large number of civil servants, including the UK ambassador to Afghanistan, inside the perimeter of the airport, still processing visa applications. And they have said that they will remain there until the last minute. We know that the threat of these attacks, which the UK Armed Forces Minister was talking about this morning, has brought forward the evacuation flights and ended the evacuation flights for many countries. The US had warned countries to remove their military and embassy personnel immediately. They said that the situation on the ground was deteriorating rapidly. We've now seen evidence of that. So we know that the last flights for the Netherlands, Poland, Hungary, Canada, Belgium and Denmark have left. They've wrapped up their evacuation efforts. And Denmark the Dutch government did admit that it's probably left some Afghans eligible for relocation behind. It just couldn't get them all on board. The Canadian Chief of Defence Staff also said, you know, we left sooner than we wanted to. We wanted to rescue more people. We just couldn't. Germany is wrapping up its flights by the end of Thursday. France will continue until Friday. The UK has 11 flights leaving the country on Thursday. Whether or not this explosion will change that is going to be unclear. But obviously the situation inside the airport deteriorating rapidly, and most countries bringing forward their deadline for pulling out.
Indeed, and of course, I suppose we're all waiting to see what contingency plans the US president has, because that will impinge on how NATO members also react to what's gone on at the airport so far. I mean, there are wires dropping even now, Charlie, from the Russian news agencies quoting that several people have been killed. Of course, they're also confirming that too. And as we know, as many as 11 have been wounded, according to the Taliban, very close to those outer perimeter walls of the airport. In terms of that list of countries that you suggested that are either halting or stopping their evacuation process, do you think that Parliament in the United Kingdom will be recalled at all in any shape or form for an emergency session? Is that likely? Would they do something like that?
I mean, that could happen. It's not something we'll rule out. There might be a Cobra meeting that could be called. I think this has been on the cards, though. The acting Armed Forces Minister today, when he was doing the media round, said, look, an attack is imminent. It could come within hours. It is credible. This is not just us, blowing hot air. He said on air, I have lines in case an attack happens while I am talking to you during the interview. So I think this is something they will have prepared for. They will have a contingency plan in place already because they were anticipating an attack on the airport. That intelligence is obviously proved true, but they will have already been putting into play some kind of plan to work around any kind of attack on the airport. They had a good idea of who might be behind it. If it is indeed this ISIL affiliate group, ISIS-K, they had a good idea of how it might happen, either with suicide vests or a car bomb. So I wouldn't say this is taking them completely by surprise. And while it might alter some plans and bring forward some plans, I don't think they're going to be, tearing up any plans, and they're going to try to be getting everyone out.
Charlie Angelo in London, thanks very much. Let's cross over to Patrick Cockburn. He's a columnist at the Independent newspaper and the author of several books, including The Rise of Islamic State. Joins me from Cork in Ireland. Mr. Cockburn, good to have you with us back on the programme. We spoke earlier in the day talking about the relationship between Taliban and the potential for ISIL attacks. It seems that ISIL have struck in an attack that is very much their style.
Yes, it is. And obviously people are extremely vulnerable. They're packed together. There are lots of sort of strange vehicles turning up. So it wouldn't be that difficult to do with minimum expertise. Of course, we don't know exactly who did it yet, but it's not too surprising. Bear in mind also that ISIL likes to top the news agenda. When there's something like this in front of all the television cameras, that's when it likes to stage atrocities like this to show that it's still a player, get people talking about it. That's really been the pattern in the last few years.
How much of a problem has it been to have all of these ISIL operatives released from jails the way that the Taliban, you might say, thought they were releasing their own people? We knew it was going to cause chaos. If what transpires is the conclusion of what happened, just 2 weeks ago, then the Taliban are going to have to deal with this now as the governing force in the country.
Yes, I mean, obviously what has happened with the fall of Kabul makes life easier for ISIL with prisoners being released. But even so, it wouldn't take many people to stage an attack like we've seen this morning against such a vulnerable target. From the Taliban's point of view, yes, I mean, I think that they'll want to show that they're in control. That's important for them because they're looking for international recognition as the new government. They will also probably see an advantage to them of ISIL being the new bogeyman in international bogeyman in Afghanistan rather than the Taliban. Many other governments in the world present themselves as the last barrier against terrorism and groups like ISIL.
ISIL does seem to operate in pockets, and we don't tend to think of them as a cohesive force in the same way that they operated in Iraq and Syria. What's the difference in the way that they've operated in Afghanistan that makes them, you might say, a thorn in the side of the Taliban?
Well, they have a sort of cell structure The US gave great attention to sort of attacking them, so there have been sort of less attacks. They don't have their sort of territorial control is very limited, but they do have some places where they still have strength in the provinces. Of course, the original Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was the size of Great Britain. It was an enormous territorial entity, but it was also made itself a target that anybody could attack. ISIL now is behaving much more like sort of Al-Qaeda did in the past, that you have a cell structure and you launch sort of intermittent attacks, but very high-profile ones. Usually against very soft targets, but ones that ensure that everybody knows that you're about this. It doesn't matter if, from their point of view, I think people denounce them, or because that shows they're there. It brings in recruits, it brings in money.
In terms of the attack here at the airport, do you think it's, again, I suppose we're in the realms of hypothesis here, is it a last, you might say, ditch attempt to disrupt the evacuation, to hit the US where it hurts, or its NATO allies? Because once the 31st arrives and these foreign forces do leave, this is a Taliban-controlled country. Will ISIL attack the Taliban in the same way? Will they continue, in your opinion, to attack the infrastructure of the country and hit the Taliban where it hurts?
Yeah, but one can one can, to some extent, play ISIL's game and interpret these, very high-profile, very well publicized attacks as damaging the infrastructure of the country. They don't. They killed, insofar as we know, 13 poor people who are crammed together with no defense. That the actual damage done to the infrastructure, to anything else, is pretty limited. And so ISIL doesn't have to be that strong on the ground to stage attacks like this. I doubt very much if the Taliban may see some an advantage from their point of view, at least their leaders will, of being the defenders against ISIS, and that will help sort of reduce their demonic status in the world. But they also don't want anybody...
Oh, we seem to have lost the sound there on Patrick Coburn, our contributor there. Patrick, if you can hear me, thanks very much for your time. I'm sure we'll come back to you again for more analysis from you, certainly with your experience. Thanks very much for joining us on Al Jazeera. Of course, these are live pictures coming out of Kabul. Now, it does seem chaotic to a certain extent, where I think the injured are either being taken away to local hospitals and clinics. Not quite sure what's happening there, but obviously there seems to be a perimeter gate of the airport. Let's join Rob McBride, our correspondent in Kabul, who's been following events as the sun sets there in the capital. And Rob, distressing scenes, we believe, near the airport where these explosions happened. For our viewers who are just joining us here on Al Jazeera, just bring us up to speed on what we know.
That's right. Well, this happened a little over an hour and around an hour and a half ago. Now, this was a blast from the direction of the airport. We understand it was confirmed as a suicide bombing close to one of the gates, and many of the people, people have been thronging to try to get onto flights. It has been defended by coalition forces, also Taliban, who are trying to be forcing people back. We understand that 3 US soldiers have been wounded in this attack. There have also been reports of deaths, at least 11 deaths, we understand, with many more injured. We understand that hospitals nearby are taking some of those injured now. There are also reports of a second explosion, although we don't know more details about that. That was said to have been a slightly lesser explosion. So this is confirmed to have been an attack. It's been confirmed by the Pentagon as being a bombing, and it is something that we have been anticipating or expecting, with multiple threats being confirmed throughout the day from multiple sources that that potentially there was a bombing that was being planned, and is being planned by the branch in Afghanistan of Islamic State. That's who we believe that the main threat has come from, although it hasn't been claimed by them and hasn't been put on them at the moment. We know from our colleagues down there that after the explosions happened, the Taliban were forcing people away from the area. There was a large rush of people, several hundred people, according to our colleagues who were down there witnessing this, running away from the scene of the blast. There was firing in the air. We believe that firing was probably from the Taliban, again, to try to disperse people. The fear with all of these attacks is that once you have one explosion, there's always the danger of a secondary explosion. And so we understand the Taliban were forcing people back. So that's what seems to have happened so far. Yeah. It does bring into question, we've had a repeat from the US State Department telling Americans not to go down there, as though that needs to be stressed. Sahel?
Yeah, of course. Rob, the pictures that we're seeing now seems to be of a local clinic where those that are injured are being ferried to this local clinic, wheeled on hospital beds and taken into the clinic. And I think that these are just, pictures of the orderlies just waiting for those injured to arrive. In terms of an update of figures, even the Russian Foreign Ministry now is saying that 2 people were killed, 15 wounded. The Americans also saying something very similar in the range of around about a dozen people injured, and 3 of their own personnel injured at the location. It seems that it's quite low level, though any injury or any death is significant. Does raise a question, though, doesn't it, about security that has to be fulfilled around the international airport, and how this impacts on anyone wanting to get to the airport to leave.
Yeah, that's as our colleagues were saying earlier on, talking to the Taliban. The Taliban were telling us earlier that there were possibilities of car bombs, which obviously would cause far more devastation rather than an individual setting off a suicide vest. So there have been fears that there may have been larger attacks, more complex attacks using larger explosives. So it is a continuing concern. And I guess the US and all of its allies will be looking now at just where their evacuation operations are up to, where they go from here. Do they look for an extension beyond August 31st, which we've been hearing about from the US, or do they work in an opposite direction? Do they now have to scale things down? We've already seen from a number of countries, such as Belgium, Denmark, Poland, and so on, that they have been wrapping up their operations. Canada also. France is likely to wrap up its operation by tomorrow, Friday, and all given extra impetus and pressure because of the fear of something like this. So it does beg the question, what does the United States do? I think the object was for the US that by tomorrow midnight, Friday local time, basically by this coming weekend, it would be the only country, the only military still operating its evacuation. So it would make it a lot easier for it to keep a control of. It wouldn't have to be collaborating with local partners. It could be talking to the Taliban, as it has been talking on a daily basis with the Taliban commander there at the airport about the ongoing operation to keep lines of communication open. But it would make it a lot easier if the US is in the sole evacuator, if you like, for it to then wrap up its operation when it was finished. And it could then have a far greater control. But it does beg the question, we still have reckoned to be well over 1,000 US passport holders still are meant to be able to, trying to get to the airport to get on evacuation flights. And then there are literally tens of thousands, potentially, of other people who could be legitimately applying for places on evacuation flights and haven't applied yet, but others who have been approved to get on evacuation flights who need to get to the airport before the deadline of effectively next Tuesday midnight local time. And the question is, how do they do that now? How do they change the security? The local The guidance so far from the US, especially given the current threats of these attacks by IS, is that nobody goes to the airport. Any US passport holders, anybody trying to get on one of its US flights, don't come to the airport. It's too dangerous. You go to a place of safety somewhere nearby, somewhere in Kabul. You notify, get in touch with people you are meant to get in touch with in the chain of command to say where you are, to identify yourself, that you are eligible to get on that flight, and you basically await instructions. And so it becomes a far more complicated operation, but it's almost like a special forces operation. Groups of people are then brought together and either taken in buses, or, as we have seen, the US doing on a few occasions in the past week or so, as well as the Germans. They've also been doing this. They actually send out helicopters to bring people from predetermined rendezvous points into the safety, directly onto the runway of Kabul airport to be processed and then put onto flights. That is the far safer way of trying to get people now to the airport, especially in light of this attack, is trying to keep people away from crowds that are around the airport, and especially these gates, which do seem to be extremely vulnerable to these attacks.
Indeed, Rob. We're getting a little bit more information, this time from the British via Reuters. They're saying they have no casualties in this suspected suicide bomb which exploded outside the airport. They're also saying that the attack happened near Abbey Gate, near the Baron Hotel. So obviously that would have been quite a busy gate that you would have known of. But also the Turks are saying they've had no injuries, as have the Germans. But we do know that the Americans are confirming that they have 3 that are injured. And we're hoping to get more information on that, certainly either from Washington, D.C. or closer to where you are if they make a statement.
That's right. Yes. So Abbey Gate is one of the gates that's been processing people to get onto evacuation flights. It's been one of those gates that we've seen over the past week or so where there's been large crowds surging forward and surging back again. And the Taliban have been making concerted efforts ever since all of this began, just over a week ago now, the chaotic scenes at the airport. They've had regular Taliban all around the perimeter, and we've seen their crowd control methods are pretty crude at times, certainly in the early days, firing volleys of shots over people's heads, getting them to push back. And until now, sadly, I mean, that's where we've seen most of the casualties. It have been in these stampedes. It causes panic. There's been stampedes of people, and sadly, people get trampled to death, including children. Some very traumatic scenes. But those have been the most serious injuries we've seen so far during these evacuations and deaths. And also, Taliban wandering around with their canes and whips, and colleagues of ours have been down there and have been whipped out of the way, told to move, and have had a cane or a whip across their back if they haven't been quick enough. We had another colleague who got an AK-47 rifle butt to his shoulder, which left him with a big bruise. So all of this has been going on, and it's only in the last couple of days or so that we've seen the Taliban actually bring in special forces. I think it's extremely conscious about the optics of these chaotic scenes, and it's tried to, wherever possible, stop people filming, grab their phones, take journalists off for a couple of hours, just to take them away, to stop them filming, or smash their iPhones, anything to try to stop images of this coming out. But they have been trying in the past few days of using special forces, and we have seen, our producer was down at the main gate, this is the main passenger terminal, earlier this Thursday afternoon, and they have made a concerted effort really to push people further back, especially given all of these alerts and these warnings about a possible ISIL attack. Down at the main terminal, for example, they brought in these buses to completely block the gateway. So there's only a tiny passageway for people to get through. And meanwhile, the Taliban have really pushed people back from what was almost like a square or a roundabout area in front, an open space in front of the terminal. So to completely clear that of people, to push them all the way back, and becoming very agitated in the process. You can sense that they were spooked, if you like, just as much as Western governments were by these threats of an imminent attack, the kind of attack we've seen, sadly.
And of course, Rob, we're seeing pictures now from our Al Jazeera cameras that are out and about in Kabul of the wounded being brought to this clinic, heavily bloodied, it seems, coming in ambulances, one after after another, chest injuries by the looks of it, and certainly being helped onto gurneys as they're taken in by the hospital orderlies to the emergency room, and people obviously gathering to watch, I suppose, the scenario unfold as these injured come to local medical facilities for treatment. We'll go to Alan Fisher now, who's actually in Washington, D.C., with perhaps reaction from the US. Hi, Alan. Obviously, a fast-moving story. The details are quite sketchy at the moment. What we do know from the Pentagon is they've confirmed 3 of their personnel were injured in or around the airport.
That's not what I'm getting. What I'm getting is that there was a number of injuries, but no figure put on that as yet. And that is from the official Twitter account of John Kirby, who, of course, is the Pentagon spokesman. So no official confirmation of Americans being injured. But certainly we know that it was just over 12 hours ago that the US Embassy in Kabul issued a warning saying that they had clear and credible threats from ISIL-K that there could possibly be an attack in and around the airport. And they warned Americans not to come to the gates because they felt that was a particular vulnerability, and not to go to the airport until they were told to by American officials. Now, ISIL-K is the offshoot of ISIL. It was formed by renegade members of the Taliban who broke away, and they've been responsible for a number of attacks in Afghanistan over the course of this year. And certainly it was a threat that Joe Biden was aware of when he spoke to the country on Tuesday. It was almost like he was saying to the Taliban, you need to keep a lid on these guys if you want us to make sure we can be out of the country by August the 31st. We can do that on that timeline, but there hasn't got to be anything that gets in the way. And this would certainly be considered to be a hurdle into the operation of getting as many Americans out as they can. You've got to remember that of the 88,000 that have been evacuated, the majority of them are Afghans. And we've heard from Jen Psaki over the last few days saying, look, they want to get Americans out, Afghans who have worked with the United States, and of course any of the United States partners and people who would be considered vulnerable. But this just can't be a free-for-all for Afghans who don't want to stay in Afghanistan because the Taliban are taking power. And we heard from the Pentagon less than 24 hours ago saying there is the possibility that they could send troops, US troops, into Kabul to evacuate Americans if that was necessary. Now, according to the latest figures from the US side, there's somewhere in the region of 1,500 Americans who are still in Afghanistan. At the embassy in Kabul, the American officials, they're in contact with about 500 of them. They're trying to get them to the airport. And there were rumours circulating just in the last few hours in Kabul that the United States was about to pull a plug on all its evacuation operations, and essentially from Friday until Tuesday, the deadline, it was going to be about what they call degrading the military operation, essentially getting military assets out of the country so they don't fall into the hands of the Taliban. John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, remember I mentioned him earlier? Well, he sent out a note saying that's not true, that the evacuation procedures will continue and they will go on until the deadline. And certainly we know Joe Biden has been presented with a couple of contingency plans. They were given to him on Wednesday morning by the Pentagon and also the State Department. They said, look, if you need to extend the deadline, this is what we can do. This is a fluid situation. So those contingency plans will have to looked at again because of what has happened in Kabul in the last couple of hours.
And of course, Alan, we were expecting the President to perhaps give another briefing, or the Pentagon to give another briefing generally about the timeline of evacuations. What's happened in the last hour and a half perhaps is going to impact now on that train of thought and the conversations that they have with their NATO allies, those that are still evacuating alongside the US.
Well, there was due to be a Pentagon briefing that was due to start 26 minutes ago. It has now been pushed back to 3 p.m. here in the United States, which is, quick math, 19 GMT, and so and I understand why they've done that. That they obviously want to get as much information as they can from their teams on the ground about what has happened, and so they're not standing in front of the cameras saying, well, we don't know about that, or yeah, we can't answer that question. That looks as if they are disorganised, not fully together. So it makes perfect sense from a PR point of view that they would delay that briefing for a few hours until they can get all the information. But it's interesting, there has been this PR offensive, essentially, by the Biden administration. We heard from Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, on Wednesday. We're going to hear from the UN ambassador at some point today. Joe Biden spoke to the cameras on Tuesday, and the Pentagon has briefed sometimes twice a day to give the latest update. They are keen to say, look, this is the biggest airlift that you've ever seen in world history, and we're doing it in a record time, and we are getting Americans out. Their big concern has always been the loss of American lives. That's when it becomes a problem domestically. That's when people start paying a lot more attention to foreign news if Americans are dying. And so that is why they'll be checking to see if any Americans were injured or killed in what has happened at Barnes Gate.
Alan Fisher there with all the latest for us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Alan. Well, let's now go across the Atlantic and speak to Charlie Angela. She's in London for us. Charlie, can you give us a sense of what US allies in Europe are now saying about what's going on in Kabul?
Well, we know that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has just been briefed on the situation, and he will be chairing an emergency COBRA meeting later on this afternoon. Now, the area of the blast, which we believe to be near Abbey Gate Baron Hotel, is a particular area of concern for UK personnel. It's been a hotel that has been used by both embassy and military staff. It's been where UK passport holders have been massing to try and get their applications processed. So we are waiting for the Ministry of Defence to confirm whether or not there have been any injuries to UK personnel there. But we have had some reports attributed to the Times newspaper that there's been no UK casualties, but we need confirmation really from the Ministry of Defence. Now, we knew that this attack might happen. The UK Armed Forces Minister was doing the media rounds this morning saying it could happen within hours. He said the threat was credible, severe, the level critical. So they will have been anticipating an attack of some kind and putting into play some kind of contingency measures. But the threat has brought forward evacuation plans, and many NATO allies have already left. Those last flights have already left the airport. So that's the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and now Germany, wrapping up all their evacuation efforts. The Dutch government saying they might have left some Afghan nationals who were eligible for relocation behind. There is nothing that they could do. The information they were getting from the US was that the situation was deteriorating rapidly on the ground and they needed to get their personnel out. The UK had planned to have 11 planes leave from Kabul airport on Thursday. Whether or not this attack will change their schedule remains to be seen.
Charlie, you're saying that some of these schedules may change. I believe something like 11 British military flights were planned for Thursday. Do we have a sense of where that process is now? Are people still going to be evacuated today, or has that all been halted?
So we haven't had an update on how many of those flights had already left pre this explosion and how many are still to go. We also don't know if 11 is the only number of flights that the UK was planning on. It could be that they were planning still to have flights leaving on Friday. Remember that the UK has invested a lot in Afghanistan. They will not want to be seen to be leaving any earlier than they absolutely have to. And they've admitted that there are 1,000 Afghan interpreters who are eligible for relocation to the UK still in Afghanistan who are trying to leave the country, and that's who they're trying to facilitate. But they were anticipating an attack, so they will have a contingency plan in place to work around what has happened. There's a lot of UK personnel still in the airport, still processing visas, including the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan, Laurie Bristow. He's saying he's going to be one of the last ones to leave, wanting to make sure everyone who can and wants to leave through the UK relocation programme gets on a flight. So we'll have to update you on whether or not their schedule's going to change.
Charlie Angela there with all the latest for us from London. Thank you so much, Charlie. Well, if you are just joining us now, I'm Nastasia Tay, and this is the News Hour live from our headquarters here in Doha as we continue our coverage of breaking news from Afghanistan. There's just been an explosion, possibly more than one explosion, just in the past hour outside Kabul airport. The Taliban is saying at least 11 people have been killed and many more are injured. This all comes after the US, Australia and the UK all warned people to stay away from the airport because of what they called an imminent threat from an ISIL offshoot in the country. Thousands, though, have still been gathering outside the airport for days in hopes of fleeing the country after the Taliban took over. Well, we have multiple correspondents covering this for us. Charlie Angela, as you've been hearing there, is in London. Alan Fisher is monitoring reactions from the Pentagon. Kimberly Halkett is outside the White House for us. But first, let's speak to Rob McBride. He's in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Rob, obviously a very fast-moving story. We're hearing reports of deaths and injuries. What do we know now?
That's right. Well, this happened just under 2 hours ago now. It's at one of the gates, near one of the gates at the airport. It's Abbey Gate. It's one of the gates where people who are eligible for evacuation flights have been taken through, but it's also one of the gates which has been thronged by many more people, hundreds, if not thousands of people trying to get onto flights, clamouring with pieces of paper that says that they're entitled to get onto flights, where we've seen all of these chaotic scenes. This explosion happened, reports of one explosion with reports possibly of a second blast, but this happened just under 2 hours ago. Our colleagues in our news bureau, which is a couple of kilometres away from here, but closer to the airport, they heard the blast. It was confirmed by other sources. They went down there, and by the time they arrived at the scene of the blast, they saw literally scores of people rushing towards them, a large crowd rushing towards them, and some very agitated Taliban, people firing into the air, trying to clear the crowds away, trying to push journalists away. Our colleagues from Al Jazeera Arabic were pushed away, had their equipment damaged. So some very chaotic scenes down there, and we understand as among the injured and dead, there were at least 10 people have been reported to have been killed. Reports of around 50 or more having been injured, and we know from the scenes that have been reaching us that many of these injured have been ferried to nearby clinics and hospitals. Also, we've had confirmation from the US that 3 of its soldiers who were at this gate have been injured. One of them is said to be in a serious condition. We've had other reports now from other media saying that NATO has pulled some of its soldiers back from other gates, deeming them to be unsafe at this moment. So that's the situation we have at present. But still very chaotic, tense scenes down there, and really raising the whole tension level across Kabul this Thursday evening.
Of course. Rob, as we've been reporting, there have been these warnings about a potential threat from ISIL-K around the airport for days now. What sort of security plans had actually been made or put in place to try to address it? I believe we have just lost Rob there. We'll get back to Rob as soon as we can. But let's now speak to Alan Fisher. He's in Washington, D.C., monitoring reaction there for us. Alan, I know the Pentagon was supposed to be briefing, a half hour ago, but that's been pushed back. What are we hearing from them now?
We are hearing from an unnamed US official that 3 Americans have been injured. That is not confirmed by the Pentagon. The Pentagon were due to start with a briefing about 35 minutes ago. Initially, it looked as if that had been postponed, pushed back to 3 p.m. local time. We're now seeing on the Pentagon website that briefing has been delayed and may start shortly. So that's something that we should keep an eye on. Clearly, the Pentagon obviously want to get information from their people on the ground. It's just over 12 hours ago that the US Embassy in Kabul warned Americans not to go near the airport or to start queuing up at the gates around the airport because, in their view, there was a credible threat from the offshoot of ISIL-K, which operates in Taliban and has carried out a number of attacks across Afghanistan over the course of this year. That threat was always on the mind of the Americans. They were very much aware of it. In fact, Joe Biden talked about it on Tuesday. Essentially, what he was saying to the Taliban is, look, you don't get on with these guys either. Make sure this doesn't happen. But it is, as Charlotte Bellis was explaining in the last hour, very much a soft target. You have thousands of people there. They can easily walk into that area. There is no one policing who can come in and come out of the area. Some of them are carrying bags. All it needs is a backpack on someone's back, and the suicide bomber can cause a great deal of damage. And from initial reports, that seems to be what has happened in Kabul. Now, there have been contingency plans drawn up. They were presented to Joe Biden on Wednesday morning. Clearly, what has happened in the last 12 hours may well mean that the Ministry of Defence here has got to go back to the drawing board and draw up new contingency plans to give to the President, because he's still very much of the mind that they can get this operation done by August the 31st. What was interesting over the last 24 hours or so, John Kirby, who is the main spokesman for the Pentagon, said, look, there is the potential that if there are Americans trapped in Kabul, they may send the military in to get them. So that would be sort of an extraction force, essentially. And clearly, given that there are discussions going on a daily basis between the Taliban and the United States, then this would be something that the Taliban would give their tacit agreement to allow the Americans to get in, get their people and get them to the airport. And we know that the Americans and the Germans over the last few days have used helicopters from pre-designated points to airlift people as well. So all of these options are now on the table. But certainly the Americans still want to tell people that they think they can get this operation done by August the 31st. Remember, the figures coming from the Pentagon in the last 24 hours were that 1,500 Americans are in Afghanistan. They have made contact with about 500 of them. They think some are intending to stay, but those who want to leave, they are determined that they will get them out by that deadline.
Alan, you mentioned there that we have heard that some US service members are among those injured today in the blast. I believe they're also expected to increase. Do we have a sense yet of a response to any of that from the Pentagon?
No, we're likely to get that in any briefing. As I say, the fact that the injuries are being talked about by an unnamed US official, there is no official confirmation from the Pentagon that any Americans were injured, any Americans were killed. It was clearly a worry for the US side during the planning of this operation. They felt that there were vulnerabilities there. They felt that while the Taliban would work with them to try and make sure that all foreign troops were out of the country by August the 31st, there was this concern about ISIL-K, which is a spin-off of essentially the Taliban and ISIL. The two do not have a working relationship. They do not get on. And it was hoped that the Taliban would be able to monitor and keep a lid, essentially, on ISIL. But given that they operate in such small cell groups, in very much the way that al-Qaeda used to operate, it was much harder to monitor them, although the Americans were aware that there was this threat, to the extent where they felt it was imminent and issued that warning just over 12 hours ago to Americans to say, stay away from the gate. The problem is you can issue these warnings that can be covered by the media here in the United States. They can get some coverage in Afghanistan itself, but not everyone has easy access to all this information. And so some people may have woken up this morning, decided that they were going to the airport to try and get through. This was the day that they were going to essentially get their departure confirmed, and just got caught up in what has happened in Abbey Gate in the last couple of hours.
Alan Fisher there with all the latest for us from the Pentagon, and we'll be covering that briefing for you live here on Al Jazeera. Let's now speak to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, I know that President Biden has already been briefed about what's happening in Kabul. What else are you now hearing from the White House?
Well, what we know is that it was more than just a briefing, that the U.S. president was in the Situation Room for an extended period of time. This is a classified setting where he is surrounded by the highest level security officials in the United States, where he is able to get in the intelligence in real time and to make decisions in coordination with the commanders on the ground in Afghanistan. And that is what he was doing until very recently. It's not clear if he is still there now. What we can tell you is that the U.S. president's schedule has not changed, and he is scheduled in the next hour to meet with the Israeli prime minister. And as a result, we are expecting to hear from the U.S. president. Now, this has been the pattern all week, and today, as we've seen with the Pentagon, these briefings have been delayed, and times they've been canceled. But so far, we are not hearing that visit between the Israeli prime minister and the U.S. president has been rescheduled. Now, Americans, as well as the world, eager to hear from the U.S. president, because not only had the White House and the Biden administration, through its embassy in Afghanistan, been warning the 1,500 Americans that are still there that there was the potential for some sort of attack, but this has interrupted the evacuation flights significantly. And the question becomes, the U.S. president will have to make a decision now. Will he extend that August 31st deadline? He has had contingency plans drawn up, and he said that August 31st deadline was firm based on the evacuation being able to continue safely and smoothly. The other factor in all of this for the U.S. president, excuse me, is that he has the calculation that the longer the U.S. troops remain in country, the greater the risk. That's something he said repeatedly, and that's why he was pushing for the August 31st deadline. But obviously, all of this has changed, and so we're watching very carefully to see what the U.S. president will say. Now, with regard to what we can confirm so far, the Biden administration is confirming that there have been U.S. and civilian casualties, but we have not had any numbers. We've not had any firm details. All they have confirmed is this was a complex attack that occurred at the Abbey Gate and also at or near the Barron Hotel, a second explosion. So as a result, we are watching very carefully to see what more the White House may update us on, and that could be happening potentially in the next hour, in addition to the Pentagon.
Kimberly, as you say, this didn't come as a huge surprise given the threat level, and there were those contingency plans being put in place. Do we yet have any sense of whether those contingency plans might actually have to change now, or whether those contingency plans were actually meant to deal with a situation like this?
Well, both could be true. The U.S. military, even before the president has requested it, is always drawing up contingency plans. My husband is a veteran of the U.S. military, and so is my photographer standing behind this camera, and they will both attest that rarely does a plan ever go as scheduled. In fact, just the opposite is what they plan for. And that is really standard protocol in the U.S. military. So as a result, we know that there have been plans for things to go wrong. Whether that is made public, relatively, I'm pretty sure it isn't. But what I can tell you is that these plans are in place. The question becomes, the commander-in-chief, the U.S. president, has to decide whether to execute on those plans. All the U.S. military commanders can do, the generals can do, is advise the president. But you have to remember, the U.S. president is the highest military official in charge of the U.S. military, and he needs to make that ultimate decision. He has been very forthcoming to the U.S. public up to this point about why he was sticking firm on the August 31st deadline, even as members of his own Democratic Party on Capitol Hill, U.S. veterans, we should point out, have argued that this was dangerous, that this could cost American and Afghan lives. He was warned about this. There have been classified briefings on Capitol Hill, and yet the president stood firm, and he made the case that he was standing firm in that withdrawal date because each day that the U.S. military and service members are there beyond August 31st is additional risk to their lives. Now, the other thing we should point out is that the United States has been very clear, and the Secretary of State said this about 24 hours ago, that not everyone may get out, but that the evacuations by the U.S. military would end at August 31st. They expected that there would still be pathways for other people to leave Afghanistan if they want to, but there was very little clarity on how that might happen. All of this is continuing to be thrown into chaos as a result of these explosions, not one but two, as confirmed by the Biden administration.
Kimberly Halkett there for us outside the White House. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Well, we can now go back to our correspondent, Rob McBride. He's in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Rob, as we were asking you before, there have been these warnings about this threat from ISIL-K around the airport area, and there had been some security plans made to address it. Can you talk us through what that might have looked like?
That's right. I mean, these threats have been around for much of this week. We first heard about them earlier this week about some vague threat from ISIL. It seemed to make sense that it might target something like this. ISIL tends to thrive on chaos and disorder, and it's a chaotic situation already that it could easily add to. We know it's a very vulnerable target. So there were. Then in the last 24 hours, 36 hours, we started to get far more concrete warnings, and also by multiple sources. In fact, we were talking to a security source just earlier today, and he confirmed this Thursday that he hadn't seen the number of sources that were confirming the same information, that there was this imminent attack, and take it seriously. And it's in fact the way that around the
I apologise. We do appear to be having some audio difficulties there with our connection in Kabul. We'll be bringing you all the latest from there as we get it. But for now, let's speak to Charlie Angela. She's across all the European reaction for us from London. Well, several countries are already wrapping up their evacuations, partly because of the security concerns. Germany, Hungary, the Netherlands, Belgium and Poland stopping their flights. Charlie, we know that 11 British military flights were planned for Thursday. Now, despite those other countries halting their airlifts, I imagine what's happened now might also change things for the UK?